I think initially what was reported was the subject spit in the face of the sergeant who was trying to remove people from a store last night. From that, the officer was attempting to make an arrest. It turned physical, and a video that we saw was a struggle on the ground in an attempt to subdue that subject to place him under arrest. And I saw people kicking the sergeant who was doing his lawful duty, where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to do, and then people trying to not only kick the sergeant, but prevent the lawful arrest of someone who broke the law. So we are now searching for the individuals who did this to our officer. Not only were they attacking the officer, they were trying to free the suspect who was actually being arrested. That's downright criminal. We're appalled by it, we're outraged by it, and we're working to hold those people accountable so that they can be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
All the reports were that, officer was effectuating an arrest, and a number of individuals were interfering, kicking him, and there was a huge press conference. The governor said something, the mayor said something, the police commissioner, the state's attorney's office, they all indicated we have to prosecute these individuals.
I think initially what was reported was the subject spit in the face of the sergeant who was trying to remove people from a store last night. From that,
they had some Facebook camera or some cell phone camera from one end that shows several people kicking the officer, and rightfully so. It wasn't a good look, right? So the officer initially says in his statement, now granted, so Sergeant Simpson is the one who responds, and he doesn't write the statement. Another officer for some reason writes the statement, but he said that Sergeant Simpson advised him while in uniform, and I'm skipping the beginning, advised while in uniform he was conducting a business check at 1527 Pennsylvania Avenue when Mr. Abdullah, who Ms. Finegar represents, and Sergeant Simpson encounter. Sergeant Simpson stated that as he was walking into the business, he took a step past Mr. Abdullah in order to get by. Sergeant Simpson advised that while passing Mr. Abdullah, he stated that the word is "excuse me," meaning Mr. Abdullah said that. Sergeant Simpson stated that while Mr. Abdullah made these comments, he intentionally started spitting in Sergeant Simpson's face. After receiving spit to the face, Sergeant Simpson advised that he then put his right arm up to protect his face when Mr. Abdullah then pushed Sergeant Simpson's arm away. Sergeant Simpson stated that this is when a physical altercation began.
You heard me say move out the way.
Walk out the store.
Okay.
You say excuse me. You talking about bump me.
When you ready.
Next time I'm gonna hit your bitch ass in your mouth. Is your problem?
Hey, what all
Go
ahead.
like
Go ahead. I
it's
got
called
enough for
excuse me. I
everybody.
don't give a it's called excuse me.
Stop my face.
You'll see in the body camera when Mr. Abdullah responds to Sergeant Simpson, not as Sergeant Simpson wrote it. When he responds to Sergeant Simpson, he actually pushes him right into the body camera, pushes his body camera, and that turns it off, okay? So at that point, his body camera is off, as far as we know, from that push, and that's what it looks like. So then the sort of encounter spills out into the street, and in the street is where we later saw all the video that was initially reported.
What did you do? I can't breathe. What did you do? Get out my neck. I can't breathe. I can't see that. Yo, what did you do? Yo, get off his neck, yo. I can't breathe. What is you do? You a boy. Hey, let him go. Let him go. I'm not moving. Yo, get off on yo. Hey, y'all can't breathe. Yo, get off his neck. Yo, you choking him. Yo, you choking him. Yo, you killing him. Yo,
When you put this case in the entire context of the initial body camera footage of how that officer responds to these individuals and the threat that he made to them and then the physical contact that he has to them, you understand why a community wouldn't necessarily be entirely respectful of what that officer is about to do. They have questions, they have concerns. They're worried about what that officer is going to do to Mr. Abdullah. They know Mr. Abdullah has a seizure disorder. Mr. Abdullah's not resisting arrest. If you look at that video, he's squirming to be able to breathe. And in fact, later body camera footage from the first officer who responds to the scene, because of course this officer's body camera footage is now not working, but when the officer responds to the scene and my client is still underneath Sergeant Simpson, he immediately, the crowd is dispersed, they've run. They're worried about what's going to happen to them, about whether or not they're arrested. Rightfully so, since Mr. Burgess was arrested. But then what happens is my client says to the officer who responds to the scene for signal 13, for an officer in distress, saying, "I can't breathe, can you get him off of my neck?" So this is not a situation where there is a neighborhood or a community attacking a police officer. This is a police officer who's gone rogue, who assaulted my client, and then from there, emotions got extremely heated, and the officer then continued to use inappropriate force against my client.
I hope y'all got them footage. Push me out the way.
What you got, man?
I walk in the store.
Trying to clear him out.
Away.
Okay. That's not helping you breathe. He won't move. He's blocking the doorway.
And you told me get the your way.
So I push past him.
You pushed
Get in
me.
the doorway. He turns, spit in my face, and he pushed me.
You pushed me.
And then I pushed him back, and the fight was on. Gotcha.
But we finally received the full discovery from the state's attorney's office in this matter. And of course, I think if people know, there was a video that we were able to provide to the press last week of the body-worn camera footage of Sergeant Simpson initiating contact with my client, assaulting Zain Abdullah. Subsequent to that, we've been able to obtain some more documents. Based upon those documents, that we're going to walk through some of the discrepancies that are in them, we filed a motion to unseal and compel the grand jury testimony. Filed that yesterday to the state's attorney's office, asked if they want to consent to it actually being released, or we're entitled to have a hearing within 15 days. The reason why we are asking for that grand jury testimony is we have very serious concerns about whether or not some information, false information, perjury perhaps, was brought before the grand jury. Most importantly, I think we knew from the statement of probable cause last week that Sergeant Simpson indicated that my client spat on him, and the video showed nothing of the sort.
I hope y'all got them footage. Push me out the way.
What you got, man?
I walk in the store.
Trying to clear him out.
Get the away.
Okay. That's not helping you breathe. He won't move. He's blocking the doorway.
And you told me get the your way.
So I push past him.
You pushed
Get in
me.
the doorway. He turns, spit in my face, and he pushed me.
You pushed me.
And then I pushed him back, and the fight was on. Gotcha.
Sergeant Simpson provided a written statement. In that statement, he completely changes his story about what happens. Rather than my client spitting on him, he says that my client started to speak and spittle came in his direction. So shortly after the time of the incident, you can already see the sergeant backing off of his statement that he made regarding this case. The other thing that's important to note is the statement of probable cause indicated that my client was resisting arrest, that he was actively engaged in a struggle with Sergeant Simpson on the ground. The video actually shows him looking like he's trying to squirm to breathe and indicating, "I can't breathe." The officers who responded to the scene, to the Signal 13 call from Sergeant Simpson and the use of force report, just days after that, indicate that he was compliant. There's already a change in the narrative. After they've seen the footage, after they've seen the interaction between Sergeant Simpson and Mr. Abdullah, it seems to me that those officers are backing away from any part of this and saying what we all saw in the video, and that is that Mr. Abdullah was not resisting arrest. Mr. Abdullah was trying to be able to breathe, an individual with a seizure disorder that's been documented by medical records that were provided to us from the jail by the state's attorney's office.
And for years, the police have controlled the narrative when it comes to incidents of use of force. But now with body cameras and cell phone technology and videos that are recovered, we are able to get a true, accurate picture of what happened. You know, we all saw the initial reports, and the public was outraged at the initial videos and what was said. But now the video, the body-worn camera, and the cell phone video has changed the narrative. It's changed the narrative about what actually happened, and His friend is saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. We want people to intervene. We want people to get in there and to help him out. And what does he do? He doesn't punch the officer. He grabs his friend's hand and tries to pull him away. He doesn't touch the officer. He doesn't assault the officer. He's actively helping his friend. It would be different if he took his knee and smashed the officer in the face, still justified, but he didn't even do that. He just went in and tried to pull his friend away, and that is the actions that we want these days.